When I was a junior in high school, I began dating my first boyfriend. I was very inexperienced with boys, so I didn't know the red flags you should look for when you first start dating. Everything went fine for the first 6 months or so. We enjoyed each other's company and didn't argue very much, but over time, I began to notice some things he did that I didn't like. He had low self-esteem and was always paranoid that I was cheating on him. He would get mad if I even glanced at a boy while walking through the hallway at school. Worst of all, he was incredibly possessive and hated when I spent time with my friends. After putting up with his crazy behavior, constant yelling, and aggression for way longer than I should have, I finally decided to call it quits. I knew I deserved so much better. I knew if I did it in person, things could get pretty messy and even dangerous, so I decided to break up with him over the phone. Just as I expected, he was furious and refused to accept that we were breaking up. After, he called me lots of terrible names. I eventually just had to hang up the phone. From that day on, he began blowing up my phone like crazy. He would call me at all hours of the night and would leave long, awful voicemails and would threaten me. You're probably wondering why I didn't tell my parents or call the police. I know. I really should have, but at the time, the whole situation was embarrassing for me. A lot of people at school already knew how my ex was harassing me, and I didn't want to bring any more attention to myself. I blocked his number and did my best to ignore him. But then he downloaded an app where you can get a new number for free and would call me on that. Eventually, I just wouldn't pick up the phone unless I recognized the number. I even had to block him on every social media app. Unfortunately, while I could avoid his phone calls, he was harder to ditch at school. He knew what classes I had and would wait outside of the classrooms for me and follow me around. He even knew where I parked and would be waiting by my car when it was time to leave school for the day. I began parking in different places to throw him off, and I always made sure I had a friend alongside me when I was walking through the hallways. But my ex was persistent, and as the weeks went by, he still wasn't getting over the breakup. He would leave notes in my locker with threatening messages about what would happen to me if I didn't get back together with him. If I didn't respond, he would try to get in touch with me through my friends. All my friends begged me to tell someone and get help, but I was too scared, so I stayed quiet. One week, I had done a particularly good job at avoiding my ex. I had barely seen him, and only from a distance. Maybe he was finally getting over me and was going to leave me alone. I drove home from school that Friday in a good mood. I sang along to the radio and thought about how good it felt to have gotten away from such a toxic person. Now, I could actually enjoy the rest of my senior year in peace. I pulled up to my house and noticed a white package sitting on the front porch. Thinking it was just something my mom ordered from Amazon, I picked it up and took it in the house. When I set it down, I noticed that it was my name on the address label. My birthday wasn't for another couple of weeks, but maybe one of my family members had sent me something early. Excitedly, I pulled the tape off and opened the box. I was surprised to find only a large manila envelope inside. Confused, I unsealed the envelope and dumped the contents out on the kitchen table. I was horrified by what I saw. The folder contained dozens of pictures of me, most of them taken at a distance. One showed me walking my dog at the park. Another showed me and some of my friends getting lunch at a local cafe. There was one picture of me working on homework at the library, clearly completely unaware that anyone was watching me. But the one snapshot that bothered me the most was the one of me sitting in my bedroom. I had headphones on and was listening to music. I thought I was alone at the time. I felt sick about the invasion of privacy. I was furious and a little bit scared. I realized that at this point things had gone too far. I felt like I might actually be in danger. That night after dinner, I told my parents I had something I needed to talk to them about. I informed them about all of the crazy events over the last couple of months, showed them the threatening notes I had gotten, and finally dumped out the pictures that were taken of me. My parents got really upset and didn't wait to take action. They called the police that night, and an officer came to our house. We filed a restraining order against my ex that said he had to stay within a certain distance away from me. Even the administration at school was informed of the situation and ensured that me and my ex would have no classes together. I was still wary the first couple of weeks after the restraining order was filled. I knew legally my ex couldn't get anywhere near me, but I had gotten too comfortable too quickly last time and knew that my ex certainly wouldn't be afraid to test the boundaries. A month went by and I began to breathe a little easier. I hadn't seen my ex at all. I hadn't received any weird phone calls or gotten any more messages or packages. I still took extra precautions though, like taking in my surroundings when I was alone and keeping my bedroom blinds always shut. I even began carrying some pepper spray just in case. I was still mad at myself for not getting help sooner. I couldn't believe how much quicker this issue could have been solved. One normal spring day, not long before graduation, I arrived home from school and parked in the driveway. My parents both worked until 5, so there was always a couple of hours where I would be by myself before they got home. I was grateful for the alone time since it allowed me time to decompress after a long day at school. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and sat my backpack down before going to the kitchen to make a snack. I decided to pop some popcorn as a treat. I heated up some tea and poured my popcorn into a bowl before heading into the living room to catch up on some reality television. I was so immersed in my show that I barely noticed that an hour had gone by. I groaned. If I didn't start my homework soon, it was going to be a late night for me. I grabbed my backpack and headed upstairs to get started. I sat down at my desk and pulled my books out. I got caught up on reading and began an essay that was going to be due for English in a couple of days. I was trying to think of a good title when all of a sudden my phone buzzed. I picked it up and was startled to see it was from a random number I didn't recognize. I didn't get too freaked out right away. It could just be someone who had the wrong number or some sort of scam message. My heart began beating faster when I saw there was an attachment. I opened the text and saw photos of myself. One was of me walking from my car into the house. Another was of me in the kitchen making popcorn. The last one was of me sitting at my desk doing homework. My heart dropped the second I came to the realization these photos had just been taken. There was someone in my house. I let out a shriek when I heard my closet door swing open. There behind me was my ex who had been hiding in the closet watching me. He stared at me with the most terrifying expression and told me he missed me and wanted to get back together. In his hand, he held a sharp knife. He told me that if I didn't take him back, he was going to kill me and then himself. I didn't allow myself to process anything. I didn't even think about how he managed to enter my house. I just ran for my life, screaming all the way. While I was about halfway down the stairs, I lost my footing and tumbled the rest of the way to the floor. I hit my head hard on the landing and accidentally bit down on my tongue. I could taste blood in my mouth and could feel it running down my face. The fall made me disoriented and it took me a minute to get back on my feet. My ex used this to his advantage and tackled me, pinning my arms and legs to the ground. I screamed in excruciating pain as I felt his knife slicing across my forehead. I flailed around trying my best to throw him off of me, but he was so much bigger than I was. I screamed as loud as I could for help, even though I knew our neighbors lived much too far away to hear me. At that moment, I heard the familiar creak of the front door opening and the jangle of keys, followed by heavy footsteps. My dad had come home early. I screamed one more time before losing consciousness. I later woke up in the hospital connected to an IV. I learned that my father had been able to overtake my ex and held him down until the police arrived. I had a slight concussion and had lost a lot of blood, so I would have to stay overnight in the hospital for observation. Still, I knew that these things could have been a lot worse. I learned to always trust my gut when it comes to people I'm dating. As for my ex, he was charged as an adult and is currently behind bars. I dread the day that he gets out. Do you think she had a lucky escape? What would you have done? Drop a comment and a like and subscribe. Until next time.
What you're about to hear was posted on the 4chance Paranormal board on Halloween Day of 2013 by an unknown user by the name of Prozac101. Being a daily visitor, I was one of the first people to reply to their post, and I think it's best that I tell you now that I was pretty creeped out by what I'd read. Probably the most I'd been in a long time. It's kind of hard for me to explain the strange feelings I got, but there was something quite different about their story, due to the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about it for days after it had been first posted on the board. Here's the story. Hey, I just thought I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone all hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living there. quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child. So, while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus just to stay home all day alone. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back, some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called. There was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of the fallen tree and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just got too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a pretty bad habit of freaking out from how high I was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot in the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock.
"Hey, kid."
I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time, I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all.
"I know you can hear me."
His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a bit higher, trembling nervously. I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The birdsong was much softer, more cautious this time. And when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faint echo of a human breathing. Gathering all of my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all in my imagination by leaning over the edge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly,
"Come down here, or I'll come up and grab you."
It was as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cold air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point that I'd never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked me and my mother, in time, I somehow recovered, exhibiting that naive, hard skin of a child. Although I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approached the fallen tree, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, and it's just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you have ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you'll know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights it got mistier than it ever had before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to the short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once, I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I'd reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, dropping all the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my knees. I decided to head to the house, since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any points of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate. And the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with the resounding silence from the depth of the mist all around me where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine tree. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow, pointing left, looking vaguely like something my mom might make. I rationalized to keep me from getting lost. So, foolishly, I followed the direction set by the green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppily written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot of getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat, so I followed the green arrow, to the point where I could dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for the trees. Although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm, I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this point, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry a little bit. As I slumped against the pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins within my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked fresh and without sign of decay despite the previous week's nonstop rain, I read it afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading that horrible note over and over again before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint blindly, and twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note in big green letters was my name. I felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed, where I remained, unsleeping till morning. Mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, or some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at that damned house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she'd never experienced any of the strange things as I had, although we mutually shared the peculiar, oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us, and its placement in this dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living way out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from Mom in all caps. "If this is a prank, I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" almost immediately the response, "Are you at home?" Of course, I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another text until around 3 a.m., when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and to not by any means dare go home. I remember those bleak torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. I'd had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all of the color had drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing against her ankles. It wasn't until later that day, when my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old Grandma, out of fear that I would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This is what happened the night I was at Amanda's. As she described in lurid detail, my mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to view the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware of, and vaguely irritated by, tiny thumping noises near her head, at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw fat brown moths of a kind we often get at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that it was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work. However, feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush, and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her, my only visible eyes stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely stifled a scream seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move or blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting out of the bush. As they continued to do so in a loud downpour, my face unceasingly continued to press at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence her text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me behind the tree just started moving as if it was mouthing silent words really fast. Suddenly it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree, who couldn't be seen, but she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, the only one with a working lock, where she shut herself in and sat in fear at the end of the bed while rocks began to patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt on the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught a distinct, vibrant sound of a window actually smashing and the weird, continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door where an awful white face could be seen staring right at her, mouth contorting and gaping in what sounded like highly sped-up whispering. The closet door was only a meter away from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before finally getting out and running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off. She said that as she glanced back, right at the end of the prolonged drive, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching her as her car got further and further away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that house again. As my mother told me this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't, and fully believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living at that house once and for all. I only went back once, with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left in the house. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, only 2 things left worth mentioning. When I checked the house for any sign of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed and the rocks were lying on the floor. Dad went out to the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we'd had the swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that the week since we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing from the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I'd stopped climbing on many years ago. It was obviously new rope, and a nicely polished sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, he doubted the affair and thought my mom was mentally unstable. Said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we literally had no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in that place, and never in my time living there did I ever see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it all go, and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I've found it best to try to forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it, though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it, but for a long while, I couldn't. Seeing as it is Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son, shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the best of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and that swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles obliviously towards it.